So one of the most important things about sleep pattern, or like being able to go to bed in time, is being able to come up with a routine. Now, something about routine that a lot of people don't understand is that routine really is actually about having, like, being able to hack into your instinctual self. Because routines have to do with habits, and habits have to do with your limbic system and your primal part of your brain. And so, being able to sleep has a lot to do with being able to hack into your instincts, because sleeping is a physical phenomenon. And so if we really want to understand that, then we need to actually understand what causes sleep. And there's a lot of science on that and things like that. But I like to say, like, even without having to go into that, one of the things that really helps to understand is what makes you feel sleepy? What allows you to feel like you're ready to go to bed? And just observing that is actually the most helpful thing. So let's say, for instance, in my case, I used to be like a real night owl, and I had a lot of trouble going to bed on time. And when I wanted to start going to bed earlier, I just started observing the pattern of what happens when I'm trying to go to bed. And I read a lot of different books. I tried them, and they were all really difficult to implement, especially if your habit wasn't geared towards that. Because one of the key things is that the reason you're sleeping late is because it's giving you a reward. And as painful as it is to wake up the next morning and suffer the consequences of having slept late, the reason we sleep late is because it's giving us a reward that we can't otherwise get. And one of the key things that I found out is that when you sleep late, no one bothers you. You get this quiet time that you get to just to yourself, where you get to do whatever you want. And I found that in my case, I'm looking for some kind of fulfillment. I want to be satisfied. I want to know that the suffering that I had in my day, during my day, was gonna somehow be alleviated, especially in the future. I spend that time distracting myself, or actually, it was kind of interesting. In the very beginning, I found myself actually watching shows, TV shows, and things like that. And it was interesting because I kept watching the same kind of shows. I mean, the show itself would change, but the genre would stay the same. But the actual, the kind of stories that intrigue me would stay the same. And the storylines would actually be that of adventure, and also like real love and intimacy. And I realized, oh, and I kept watching these shows until I fall asleep. And when I went, when I wanna, when I wanted to stop these shows, I feel like this feeling of just one more. And of course, these shows are created to be super addictive. But from that, actually, I realized something. I have a real need for intimacy and actually adventure, like feeling like something is gonna happen with my life. And when you go to your work and your job, and you um, have to be responsible as an adult, some of these core needs that we have uh, don't get addressed. And part of it is we don't get to see it. Like, sleep is an obvious thing. Like, if you don't sleep, the next day you suffer. So you're like, oh, you know, um, like, you gotta sleep. And but, like, why you're not sleeping, that's a lot less obvious. And we don't get to those, and we don't get to look at those reasons, the why behind. And so because of that, oftentimes we have trouble switching our habits, because we don't understand what reward is it. I mean, what rewards is it that we're looking for? The other thing that makes it difficult to find is because a lot of these have to do with our preferences. And our preferences are actually tied to what would calm us down and actually bring balance to our system. And so actually ultimately it comes down to balance. So now sometimes actually being able to be in a forceful situation where you are put on a routine does really work. Meaning, as let's say, for instance, some people go to the army, and then all of a sudden they're put into the situation where they have this routine forced on them, and then they learn, and then they come back out and they change for life. But it's also true that some people who leave the army, their life doesn't change at all. They come back and then they fall back in. So why is it that for some people it worked and why is it for some people it didn't? And that's a really good question. Why didn't it internalize? Whereas it internalized for some other people. And I think that's actually the interesting portion that I want to look at. Because the people where it didn't internalize, they still felt the benefit. And if you talk to those people who at some point had that routine, they'll always look back onto those moments and say, when I had that routine, my life was so much more balanced. Why can't I do it now? Um, and that's actually the real good question. Actually, I'd like to say that it's also, to me, related in a lot of ways to addiction. Because because one of the reasons we can't go to sleep is because of addictive behavior, because of trying to look for some kind of excitement. And so, and so from that perspective, it's almost like you have a habit you can't quit. Which how this addiction is typically defined. And so the question is, why can't we quit this habit and then go on to this routine that would obviously balance our life? And I'd like to say it's because as it would, it still would not balance something else. And so um, like an example I'd give is like, let's say for instance, if you go back to this army idea, most likely what was really making the routine work was the social environment. So if you go to a certain group of people where you're doing things together, there's a meaning that comes from achieving something together, and doing things together. It bonds you to other people. And oftentimes that brings us profound meaning. So let's say, for instance, one of the core needs was feeling socially satisfied, and all of a sudden you take that away, then one of the key ingredients, the rewards of why you are going to bed is taken away. You're actually missing a piece. And because of that, all of a sudden your routine is not working. And what people find out is that routines work really well with other people. It's one of the reasons why accountability groups are so satisfying. And if we look at groups such as the 12-step groups, one of the reasons the 12-step groups are so effective and so powerful is the are two things. Is actually the accountability with people that care, and actually, maybe I should say three things. Of course, the deep spiritual principles that you get to discuss about life, and you really fundamentally learn about life. And then third, the intimacy that you get to share, where you get to have voice. A lot of these people never just had the chance to be able to speak with intimacy. And one of the reasons people drink, actually one of the key reasons people drink, is because it calms them down, and when you drink, you actually get to feel because you're not thinking so hard anymore. And it's not uncommon that you get to just talk to the person where you're drinking, or at the very least, when even if you're drinking by yourself, uh, you're actually somehow getting a very deep emotional need met, and sometimes even instinctual from traumas and things like that, where you're dealing with some deep loneliness and deep needs. And when you're in a support group like the 12-step group, then you get to fundamentally know that someone cares enough to listen to you. There's a whole group of people, and you get to connect, and you don't get to feel so alone, and it actually allows you to do what needs to be done. And so the the question becomes like, what are the key ingredients that allows you to um, be able to have a routine? And so if we don't understand what benefits we're looking for, then it becomes very difficult to be able to make any of these routines work. And so one of the first things I actually recommend is that you actually just bring awareness to what benefits you're getting. Like you've had an evening and again you didn't sleep, instead of actually beating yourself up as to why you didn't go to bed early when you know that you should have gone. Look at all the activities that you did instead, and then write down why you were doing those activities. Because those activities are strategies to try and have your needs met. Those are the best strategies you found to have your needs met. What what need is it that you were trying to meet by engaging in those strategies? And the reason I say write is I really recommend that you don't think about this, because uh, you'll find that actually oftentimes you're looping. It's really worth the trouble. Most of the time it feels like too much of a hassle, but I like to say that if you think you can do it in your head, but you find yourself looping or thinking about the same thing again, after about the third time, I recommend that you just pull out a piece of paper or your computer or your smartphone and just start typing into it. And you'd be surprised. The same effort that was going into trying to think and actually agonize and beat yourself up, that takes a lot of energy. Actually, beating yourself up takes a lot of energy. On top of that, you're trying to make yourself feel so bad that you won't do it again, on top of actually feeling bad. So you even feel worse. And then you have less energy to do anything. But and because you have so little energy, we oftentimes want to conserve the energy of having to write. But it's kind of interesting because there are different kinds of fatigue. One is a mental fatigue, and emotional fatigue. And you're actually physically oftentimes not fatigued. It's actually the mental and the emotional fatigue that's making you tired. Instinctually, you're fine. And so if you start writing, you'll be surprised that actually it gives you energy. Um, and it alleviates your mental load and your emotional load. So you start becoming more and more energetic, and you find out that it's a much better alternative. If you're actually physically tired, you'll be falling asleep. Uh, and so one of the reasons you're not falling asleep is because you're mentally tired and you're emotionally tired, but you're physically not tired. Because if you're physically tired, as you're trying to write or even as you're trying to think, you'd just be falling asleep. That's physical fatigue. So now, however, even if you're not physically tired, if you're excited enough and it's actually better to go to bed even if you're physically not tired, but just because your body is relaxed and it wants balance. And that's really actually what we're looking for. So I just want to make sure that as I'm saying physically tired, it's like, oh, does it mean that I need to do physically more things? It could be. Right? That's actually one of the things that we're trying to figure out. But anyways, so I was just trying to talk about the validity of why you should write things down to get it out of your head and loop it and to write it down, because most likely the kind of things that you're dealing with, there's a lot more complexity than what the actual memory load of your mind can handle. Meaning as in how many things your mind can hold all at the same time and juggle. So, um, so from there, as you write things down, write down all the strategies, like, oh, you're searching on the internet, or you're on Facebook. Write down what need it is that you're trying to take care of. If you're bored, then what ideally, like if you were not on the computer, what would actually help you not be bored? Well, what could you have done during the day that would have made a difference? And as you start understanding your needs, you might find out that your needs have been neglected for a long time. And that those needs, like how important those needs are. And you might actually start finding out that those are called internal triggers. So there are external triggers and internal triggers when it comes to habits, but meaning as in, what cues you up to do something. And like if you're in the army, there's a time, there's a schedule, there's a routine, and like everyone does something at the same time. And so of course, those are the things. Internal triggers is when you do something out of your own volition. And so when you're sleeping late, you actually have a routine. You may just not have the routine you consciously like, but you have a routine. You have a routine because the kind of things that you do at night is going to be more or less within a certain amount of repeated behavior. And so you know that actually you have a routine, it's just you don't like your routine, consciously speaking. Your instinctual self or your emotional self might like it, that's why you keep doing it. And that's difficult to admit because you feel like it's ruining your life. So as you write it, you might start seeing needs that were not met that have to be met. And those are the internal triggers. So when you feel that loneliness, you go to Facebook. When you feel that sense of adventure, you watch something. Or when you feel like you want to, whatever it is, you'll notice that there are internal emotional cues. And it's critical that you find out what those cues are. And once you figure out what those cues are, then all of a sudden you start having freedom. Because now you can come up with strategies that are actually effective to address those cues. And so it takes, like I'd say, give yourself a good week to just collect some information, to maybe two. I mean, it's gonna take some time. The one thing I'd like to say, it's gonna take some time because your entire life is set up a certain way, and all your habits and your routines, it's an entire ecosystem. So when you change one thing, you'll find out that it's actually not as easy to change one thing as you think. And so the smaller the change, the better, because the ripple effect on your life is less. If a change is big, then it starts infringing upon your other habits, and your other habits start pushing back. That's one of the reasons why there's such a snapback for why things don't work. But if you make a small change, just a small change, as a matter of fact, just observing your uh, evening routine or your nighttime routine as to why you're sleeping late is a small change in habit. It's so imperceptible that it doesn't disrupt anything because you're just collecting data. And then if you start writing, that's another small change. But when you're taking time to write about what your habits are, you're actually doing something else than what you're doing. So you're already effecting a change. And that small change actually is already better than watching something, because now you're internally processing and you're turning inward, and you're doing something healthy. You're already balancing. And so there's a small change that replaces other behavior. So when you're changing habits, you need to think in terms of replacing behavior. Instead of not doing something. And so the smaller the change, the better it is. And then you say, okay, I'm gonna just start with not watching something. That's actually great. But I'd like to say you also need to look at what you're gonna do, because let's say, for instance, you decide I'm not gonna watch shows, because once I start watching shows, I watch 6 hours straight. I'm not gonna binge anymore. And then you say, I'm stopping this. And then the next thing you find out is you're surfing on the internet. Why? Because that habit has to be replaced with something. And so, for instance, what I would recommend is, and this comes into super stimulants, nowadays everything is available. Most likely you're suffering because of media. There's a very good chance you're suffering because of media. Media has become so good. These shows are so good. These games are they're designed to hook our nervous system into it and gets us into the most excited state. And it's like research shows, a lot of these things actually show our brain as if it's on cocaine. They're highly addictive. And when you are on cocaine, you're driven, and your dopamine is actually releasing, and when you find some of the things that you're looking for, your endorphins are releasing, and they're highly pleasurable neurotransmitters that make us feel good. And so, of course, we want to feel good. And when we're feeling that something is lacking and our system is out of balance, then we want painkillers, and those are painkillers. They're literally painkillers. And so to try and replace that with something else that seems dull can be a very painful experience. And so when you are watching shows and you're trying to you're trying to just stop it, that's going to be very ineffective. And you're going to try and your instincts are going to try and find a replacement that's just as effective. So instead of doing that, what you want to do is you want to find something that will meet your need, but not get you hooked in like that. So, like for instance, you read a book, and instead of actually reading a novel, you read an autobiography, because it kind of reads like a novel, but it allows you to reflect and contemplate on your life, and it may not be as exciting, but it's actually exciting enough, and it's oddly fulfilling. There are lots of great autobiographies to learn from. Or you read a book that's nonfiction, and I recommend nonfiction because fiction is almost as good as TV shows. I remember many a nights where I had this smart idea. I replaced the TV show with an equivalent, but it was reading a book. It's a novel, and I just stayed up just as late. Books are powerful, but I replaced it with nonfiction, and it really started changing my life. And if you want to, replace it with nonfiction on how to sleep better. There's a little humor, right? And then you can learn valuable information, and at the same time, it is entertaining, uh, and so on and so forth. And so, if you, let's say, for instance, your need was to emotionally connect, then journal. Journal with your or read an autobiography because that does help you connect with people because it was a person and you get to read about someone's life and then actually it helps you engage with your own emotional life and or write a letter to someone as in like an email, but just make sure that you do it on a document because otherwise you're gonna get sucked into other email unless you have email regulating systems where there's like a pause in your inbox so you're not seeing your emails. It's very important that you don't get sucked into media. And so that kind of actually, so the first phase of any habit change is being able to make sure that you identify your needs and what your strategies have been to meet your needs so far. Once you understand that, then you know how to replace it, as I said. And then comes actually some physiology, understanding of some physiology. So if you look at blue light, it stimulates your brain because it's reflective of sunlight, daylight. So you need to be looking at red light, and so you want to switch your media so that um, it reflects media if you're reading as Kindle or something like that. But other than that, I recommend that you actually dim your lights at night. You turn on some quiet music. You will need about at least 2 hours, preferably 3 hours to calm down. One of the key things that you'll find out is that one of the other reasons why we keep watching media is to literally tire ourselves out by doing something because we feel awake. So we're trying to get our bodies to be tired. And it used to be that society was highly physical, where during the day you go and farm or you go and hunt, or if you're nomadic, then you'd be traveling. It's really tiring. If you've ever walked all day, you'll find out that's a lot of work, and people used to physically move. So by the time sun set and uh, it became dark and you're eating your meal, you're ready to go to bed. Now we sit. We don't have a lot of physical activity, so we have a lot of energy, actually, physically speaking. Your energy hasn't been spent. Uh, and so we're actually waiting to tire ourselves out. And we're trying to keep ourselves entertained while that's going on. Or sometimes what happens is we are tired. We had a like long day, and then because of media, we get the second wind. And second wind typically comes between 10 and 11 p.m. And you'll notice that all of a sudden after 11 p.m., bing, and like you feel like you can last till 2 a.m. Or so, and then you'll notice that there's another wind, and then you can like go to 4 to 6 p.m. And you need to really watch these times. And so your activity, if you want to sleep before 12, then you need to actually try and sleep before 10 or 11. And then you need to wind down 2 hours before that. So think about what that means. That means that and for a lot of us, it will be 3 hours before that. So that means that we need to start winding down. If it's 10 p.m., we need to start winding down around 7 p.m. Doesn't that sound really early? That's why a lot of people fail at it. And so you look at people who go to bed around 10 or 11 p.m., they eat dinner around an early supper, 5 or 6 p.m. And then the dinner gets done around 7, uh, and then they kind of clean up, they listen to a little bit of music. There's a common routine. They wind down, they drink a little wine, they talk, or they read a book. And if you go back to the days before any media was there, that's actually what family would do. Family would get together, they would eat, and then they would clean up together, and then they would sit around the fire, which is like red light, and then someone would be playing the fiddle, or someone would be telling a story. There was TV back then, and then a lot of times people would be knitting or doing something like that's crafty, um, and or people would just be talking. And then people, okay, it's like time to go to bed. Like, look at that routine. And so we need to physically wind ourselves down where we can calm our nervous systems. And on top of that, you get to connect. There's like some emotional connection. Like there's a story, there's a music, like there's fire. Have you even noticed that like when there's fire, fire is magical. You just get to reminisce and just look. You get to reflect your whole day. It's kind of like journaling, actually. You get to reflect your day, and then you talk about your day. Um, and then like you feel fulfilled. It's good. It's a good day. And so you did the work you needed to do. You got to hang out. You got to eat some food, and then preferably good food. And then you got to emotionally connect and reconnect and review your day, and then kind of look at what you're going to do tomorrow, and you start again. And so that's what sleeping is about. So essentially what we need to do is we need to kind of look at how are we going to create an ecosystem where our needs are being met. How are we going to fill those in? What are those needs? And then how are we going to fit those in while calming ourselves? And can we actually have those needs met earlier on in the day? That's why exercise is so important, because if you're working, I highly recommend that you try and go exercise during lunchtime if you have an hour of lunch, where you at least actually do something for 20 to 30 minutes. And sometimes we wonder, wow, is that even worth it? It is definitely worth it. Um, if you can take a longer lunch, that's even better. So if you have something packed and you can eat like without rushing, but within, typically it actually doesn't take us that long to eat if we're not talking. But let's say, for instance, if you eat within about 15 minutes or so, and you can exercise for about 20, and like commute, let's say, for instance, like you find something close to your work, 5 minutes, or if there's a place at work that no one bothers you, then actually there's ample time. And so I highly recommend that you do that, or in the morning when you wake up before you go to work. Then you set your whole day up, and then you physically tire yourself out. The work itself you're doing, even if it's mental, will still physically tire yourself up. And then do something emotional. Listen to an audiobook that resets you while coming back from work, in your car, in your drive. If it's like 30 minutes to an hour, that's a lot of good time. And listen to stuff that really engages you with your life, nonfiction, whether it's an autobiography or something that allows you to learn about something. And it kind of resets how to have better relationships and things like that. And you come home, and then now your home life starts, and then like kind of start the ecosystem. If you're by yourself, same thing actually. Having a relationship where you take care of yourself is a foundation where you can actually relate to other people. So, okay, hopefully that was helpful, and that will help you set up a good nighttime routine. Thank you.